So having been here at CMG in the past, I'm kind of really not talking about some of those things that we just spent a lot of time thinking about really cool things. I've been more concerned about like a different kind of digital transformation, which perhaps customers don't care about very much, but most of us do. At Capital One, we've been involved in taking everything out of the data centers and moving them to public clouds. And so when I made up this title, I forgot that we were going to be in Seattle, where like even if you're a mainframe guy, you know we're under cloudy skies all the time here, right? But I've been doing capacity planning or related things for quite some time, right? And in the past couple years, since my job at Capital One has become to be responsible for the efficiency and especially the efficacy of our cloud effort, which kind of means like everything at the bank, I've noticed that a few things have kind of changed, and it's a kind of a digital transformation kind of thing. So first of all, people would say like, why do we do capacity planning in a cloud when you can just scale everything up immediately? And it's a reasonable question, right? And I think I stopped to think about it. What's different about capacity planning now than years ago, right? Some things are the same and some things are not, right? So one thing that's different is like when you can still botch it up, but the impact of botching it up is probably not the same. When you do capacity planning is a different thing. Who does your capacity planning is different, and by the way, that's very possibly a scary thing for people in this room, because generally, historically anyway, it was like us that did that, and if it's a different set of people, like, wait a minute, who's that, and what about me, right? There's a whole bunch of things that are different about where the limits might be, what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, what is success. The data that goes into building a capacity plan is sometimes quite different. The applications have not stood still. I remember, you know, the days of the giant 2.5 million line, monolith, and as scared of those as I was, I'm a lot more scared about some of the things I see today. Hey, wait a minute. That's about everything, isn't it? I mean, what's kind of the same? Not a lot, right? You were talking about a digital transformation. That's digitally transformed of capacity planning. So there's a bunch of things, right? If you mess up a capacity plan, you will still create a CNN moment. Asked the folks at Amazon about S3 about 18 months ago. You can still have a pretty big black eye, but at least the difference is that it used to be like when you made a mistake or someone made a mistake, recovering it was like you had to go buy something, and that meant you had to go and spend money, which meant that you had to go, beg forgiveness for somebody. That's what it usually meant, right? I was involved in more than one where somebody had to go to the board of directors again, going like, yeah, that $5 million that you gave me last year. It's like, well, really it was $7 million. Not really the sort of thing. Today, you can often in a cloud you can do this completely differently, right? It's not, it's an OpEx problem, not a capital problem, and so probably it's one of these mistakes is kind of in the order of like a few $1,000s, maybe it's per month, but at least it's probably below somebody's signature authority, right? Somebody who actually cares about this. On the other hand, one thing that's probably not so well understood about a cloud is that it is a whole lot easier to leak money to your provider than it ever was when everybody was like paying attention to like how much you spent on computers. Did I say leak? Because of some of this is a pretty distributed thing, right? It used to be that there was a certain set of purchasing people that could sign for things, and maybe that was maybe a few hundred people in a really big company, maybe in a small company it was like a dozen or something like that. And now I have the problem that I have roughly in the vicinity of 9,500 people that have signature authority to go buy something from one of my cloud providers. That's pretty different too. But at least you can recover it, right? So when do you do capacity planning? Well, we used to do it before you launched anything because, of course, you had to go buy something, in order to do that. And if you were really rigorous about it, you would check your capacity, before important events or things like that, but it would kind of be as occasional basis, right? Now, you probably need to do it before you launch your first, stuff, right? But then in a DevOps world, you're probably going to launch that stuff, pretty frequently, right? So you get a chance to check it again. And you can adjust pretty quickly. And as a matter of fact, depending on what you're doing, you may be changing your capacity a couple times a day. Maybe not. Maybe it's a couple times a week. But how often did you buy a mainframe a couple times a week? Probably not, right? Who does capacity planning? This one came as a real shock to me, right? There's historically, at least in the big organizations that I've worked in the past and usually worked with, there was some central skill group. Many of us were, those people, right? And we had to be consulted or, were part of that decision-making process. This whole DevOps thing, where particularly in a cloud, right? This is completely disaggregating us, right? At least in my company. Like I told you, I have 9,500 people that can sign for the couple $1,000 that it costs to launch their stuff. And the author of that infrastructure as code, at least I hope it's infrastructure as code. Maybe it's somebody just like clicking on a portal, but let's hope they're actually doing it in an automated way. They're the ones that decide what kind of stuff to use, right? Now. And like most of these people have never done capacity planning. People in this room know that capacity planning is actually a discipline or a sub-discipline of computer science. And when you do it, when DevOps teams do it like this, they usually do a pretty terrible job of capacity planning. It may not even be their job, right? I've had many teams. The conversation goes like, the boss goes like, we need the following 5 new features, X, Y, Z, W, A, and make sure it never crashes. Like, what part of the capacity or the cost or the efficiency or even the effectiveness of this is embodied in that kind of assignment? Maybe implicitly, right? But when you're asking somebody to do this that has never done it before, how well do you think they're going to do it? It's not that like all these people are dumb people, but it's not really what they've been used to doing. And meanwhile, those of us who have been doing it are sitting off in some corner someplace trying to solve some other problem, probably, right? Which is not a good situation, for the organization as a whole. There are limits. Capacity planning is fundamentally about taking a business problem and solving it with a bunch of computer stuff, right? And at some point, a lot of that is just like figuring out what the limit is so that you can work around it. little bit of a crass definition, but it's pretty much what it is. There are, if you haven't been in a cloud much, there are a lot of limits in a cloud that you probably haven't run into before. There are limits to how often you can make a call to the cloud provider's APIs, or maybe not just your cloud provider, but maybe some of the data sources that you use to do your capacity planning. And sometimes these can be quite surprising. Did I mention that they're often not published? Like their existence is not published. Forget what the rate is, right? Surprise, surprise, you can't actually tell the system to go launch that anymore because you've caught, well, launch it, they'll usually let you launch as much as you want, but maybe you can't terminate it. One of them is a revenue opportunity for a provider, one of them is not, right? But those limits that I just mentioned, you thought they were the same, didn't you? I mean, in your data center, in your primary region, and your failover, I mean, why wouldn't they be the same? Because they're all different? Everybody has the same hardware pool. I mean, it's, in a certain sense, like, there's the saying that goes around that says, there is no such thing, it's just somebody else's data center. And there's a certain amount of truth to that, right? I mean, it's not very true, but it is true to a certain degree. But I mean, you can certainly have a capacity plan a perfect capacity plan, and then get a surprise when you ask your provider to go and execute on that. Now, for many companies, many organizations, maybe that's not possible. But like if we move like tens of thousands of instances from from operating in our primary into our backup, even Amazon and Google don't have like tens of thousands of those things operating free in every zone. So you could get a surprise even at that, right? Even like in an infinite scale sort of situation. Most of these are not problems that we've ever had before in our data centers, at least I don't remember them. The data that underlies a capacity plan. I had one of my staff tell me, we can't do that. That would be like gigabytes of data. Like, Now, we're getting terabytes of data. I'm going to bet that I'm going to get some of my things are going to be providing to me tens of terabytes of data per month, probably within the next 6 to 9 months. That's a lot of data. Some of our code that we used to use probably isn't prepared for that sort of thing. There's a lot more of it. It means a lot of different things to different people. One of the things that we talked about in the panel was the data that you use to make decisions, right? Here's an example of that, right? At least where I've been, we've spent most of our time focused on infrastructure like CPU busy and like the I/O rates on networks and things like that. And really, to be honest, most of my customers, end customers, people in the customers of the bank really don't give a crap about that. All they care about is like, did it respond in the right time, right? Well, we should be correlating those things. And we can now get a lot of that data, but correlating the data from the application level with all the infrastructure level things, with all the cloud provider level things. Oh, did I mention that that you might be in more than one provider, and that they all have slightly different semantics? That's a microcosm of the data problem that all the organizations have. You got the same data, it means different things, it has different interpretations of the same data, and some of those are going to be as simple as like, oh, these are in feet per second and these are in meters per second, but some of them are not so simple. But that's what it takes to do a capacity plan for some of the applications that we have today, which is kind of a frightening thing, really, to me. At least I have spent most of my career dealing with a certain set of stuff, and there's always been a computer to measure. Except that, I can't put an agent on the server that's running a serverless function. And what part of serverless do you not understand is what my Amazon person told me, right? Which, I get it, right? But gee, if I can't get an agent in there, how do I collect data from it? Okay, you can ask your provider for it, but does your provider provide you the data that you need to actually correlate with those other things that you are going to get from your applications? Probably not, actually. Probably a little bit different. You probably have to do some sort of impedance matching between the kind of data you're going to get from your provider, from the other provider, to your infrastructure, to your applications, because they're all going to view this thing as a little bit differently. I think this problem has been that way for a while, for many of us, but it's gotten a lot worse. At least it seems to me. The applications, this one just scares me. It used to be, I remember thinking in just absolute amazement when MVS crossed the 1 million lines of code mark. How many of you remember 1 million lines of code in MVS? How many of you remember MVS? Yeah, okay. I remember seeing some of you, so I know you. I know some people remember this, right? Today, it is really, really common for an application to be like 1 million lines of code. Oh, and by the way, I can't even count the number of libraries and packages that it sucks in. All the Java libraries and, for gosh sakes, some of my monitoring libraries are probably approaching 1 million lines of code just for monitoring, right? And so they're a lot bigger. They're a lot harder to figure out. But microservices just scare the crap out of me, right? I get microservices. There's a perfectly great reason, software engineering reason, why microservices, right? Because you can actually tell whether it's right or not, right? You can actually, test it in some rational, possibly complete way, right? So there's a really good reason for that. But what happens when you take like an application that has 1 million lines of code that imports 2 million lines of code that's consisting of microservices that are 100 lines apiece, right? You get 300,000 microservices, right? Wait a minute. Where did I get lost? If I have to monitor like the interaction, I want to find out like where things getting lost, in a fully microservices thing. I'm probably going to spend an interesting amount of CPU and resources running the monitoring code just to find out which microservice was the culprit. And people go like, oh, well, that's no big deal. It's like the computer's a lot bigger. It's like, well, actually, it's not just a computer problem. It's like a complexity problem, right? How do I do these things? It's not really that obvious to me, right? But your applications are changing in some very, very relevant ways like this, right? So there's there's a bunch of different things that we talked about here, right? How do you succeed? Well, for one, and this one became apparent to me only after I kind of was immersed in a cloud for, I don't know, a year or two. If you're gonna live in the cloud, live a cloud lifestyle. Like in a data center, it really doesn't matter. If you bought the computer, and it doesn't really matter very much whether you run it 100% or 1%. But that does matter in a cloud, right? Because you could go buy something different and save yourself a lot of money, right? You really, because, I forgot to say something there. The second thing is like, many of these things really kind of fall under the heading of like living a cloud lifestyle. But if you're in a DevOps world, how many of you are not in a DevOps world? oh my gosh, everybody. Okay, I figured like a third would say something. But so if you're in a DevOps world, you really need to figure out how you're going to put capacity planning and related skills back on the path, right? And I think the only way you're going to do that is to like build tooling to put it into the infrastructure as code that you use, because there's no other way to go to everybody in your organization and train them on capacity planning, right? There are lots of things about like all the limits that you may or may not hit. You want to find them, and even if your provider won't or can't document it for you, they should be part of your run book, right? We've had a few very surprising things like, why doesn't the so-and-so work? Well, because we hit somebody's limit. And usually you can raise these limits, usually. But you have to know what they are, and that's an interesting amount of work. There are a lot of things that the providers build to allow you to dynamically scale things. We found that many of those things are crucial, like an auto scale group where you can tell it to launch more computers if you need them and turn them off when you don't. It sounds like a great, it's a great idea. Most of the implementations are a little less than perfect, but I'm sure they're going to get better. I know they'll get better. But when you have like variable load, you can spend. We've often found you can spend 90% less in a cloud than you did when you capitalized everything just by doing autoscale groups. And 90%, I mentioned this, can be kind of a big deal, right? But you have to get people to like rock this, right? You have to get them to care about what the bill looks like. When you have to produce a plan or even an analysis of the current state of one of these modern applications, you kind of have to look at all the data sources you have, and if it's a big one, you're probably going to have to create your own impedance matching things, right, to convert those data from one form to another, and to convert the semantics into something that's reasonably compatible, right? You will need to work with application teams to do this, because I think it's probably going to be more invasive than in the past, particularly when you're doing things like microservices and serverless functions that can't be, you can't just like know what happens. You have to go and stick something into their code to find out what it is. And you're probably going to find that you're going to get some resistance. That's my source code. Don't put your stuff in it. The question is, am I suggesting that you could add some resistance for instrumentation? And yes, that's exactly what I'm saying, unfortunately. And I've probably made it sound a lot more antagonistic than necessary, because sometimes there are really good reasons for that they don't want to do it. Like, I only have I'm down to the last millisecond on the budget, and I can't take another one. But yeah, there's a lot of resistance to those things. And particularly particularly if they haven't really gotten to like microservices, and there's kind of like mini services. There's a lot of code there, and they don't really want. It may be somewhat delicate, and adding more people to that don't really know what they're doing to that code. They know what they're doing, they just don't know that code, can be kind of problematic. We've had an interesting number of those. Planning at the application or business level, I don't know how common this is. Maybe I have a very skewed, because I've worked with infrastructure companies for a long time, maybe I have a particularly skewed vision of this or experience. Doing a plan for an application or a service, in my opinion, has been quite different than planning for infrastructure services. Infrastructure consumption, I guess maybe is a better way to put it. all those things, I guess, like I said, really come to, maybe I should have titled this like living the cloud lifestyle. I don't know, maybe that's a different way to put it, but I think you'd agree that most of these things are pretty different, right? Even if capacity planning is still the same fundamental task of like, taking a bunch of computers and assembling them in some interestingly optimal way to provide, to run some business service at some like sensible cost. This is a pretty different world, isn't it? So with that, I think I'll leave you there, and I'll open it for questions. Yes, sir.
I'm struck by something on this slide. It seems, Andre Bonde, I'm struck by something on this slide. It seems to me as though the cloud has made, and DevOps have made the need for performance awareness throughout the software lifecycle and throughout the development community and among stakeholders even more pressing than they were recognized as being before in a physical environment, which is to say, not enough.
I agree with that.
Sorry?
I would agree with that.
What can one do to advocate performance awareness and create a greater sense of performance awareness at the corporate level, but also at the university level? Performance is not taught in many American universities, and not many universities abroad either, although it's, judging from some noises I've been getting, it seems to be growing in India and Germany quite a lot. What can we do to create this kind of awareness at the corporate level, and how do we as practitioners promote this among the other stakeholders so as to create this kind of awareness? There's a misconception out there that if you don't need to worry about capacity anymore because the cloud provides it all for you. They seem to have forgotten that they're paying for every little piece of it, and that you can still botch performance by having a bad software design, even in the cloud.
Well, like I said, you can still make a CNN moment.
Right.
Right? So I think you raise a good point about the universities. And now that you say that, I think, gee, I was worried about performance back when I was in university, and boy, I was considered weird. As far as doing it in a corporate environment, my advice is not to express it in terms of performance, but in terms of cost. Most of the decision makers don't really understand very much about performance, and really don't care what the performance is. All they care is it's good enough, right? But when you get to somebody at the level that has a profit and loss, then they care about the cost. And my experience with my own stuff at the bank, and as well as quite a few years before that, I'd say that it's pretty common to find half of the budget or more and reclaim it. I mean, when I worked for one of the, I worked for Sun, and I was absolutely amazed one day to find out that, I was down at the factory, and every one of these machines, we had this machine that was an 8 CPU, and I was amazed at how many of them went out with 4, like 85 or something like that % of them were 4 CPUs. And we're like, I know better than that. A whole bunch of these need 2. A whole bunch of these need 6 or 8. Why are they all going out with 4? And the answer was, we buy 4. If we don't have enough, we come back and get some more. We only needed 2. Oh, well. And we still have that in the cloud. The difference is that you can change it in the cloud. It's pretty hard to change it, when you're capitalizing it. So I think my advice to you is really express it in terms of cost. Do the analysis.
And teach the university students how to do that analysis, I suppose.
Well, yeah. I need to think about that part. But yeah, I mean, it's like, you're right. I mean, it's because it's almost a lost art. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, from the conceptual point of view, what's changed between the outsourcer and cloud services?
Conceptually, well, other than you can still screw it up. Like I said, like my second slide was like pretty much everything except the basic methodology is probably different, right? Who cares, who doesn't, when they do it, how you recover from it, the data that you use, they're all pretty different. They're all pretty different than what I did as recently as maybe 6 or 8 years ago. But you still need the same basic set of skills, right? To Andre's point, like if you teach them people the basic and analytical skills of like, well, figure this out by getting this kind of data and combine it in a relatively few ways, right, to do the analysis, you're probably okay. As long as somebody's going to consult you, that's the first problem, right, because we've been disaggregated, right? And as long as somebody cares, right, and as long as you have the data on which to do that stuff, and as long as the data is in a scale that you can accomplish, well, you know, nothing's changed.
Hey, thanks a lot. I got a question for you. So you guys were here last year, presented about capacity planning at Capital One. If you were back 3 years from now, will you be presenting, you think you'd be presenting most of the same challenges, or will you guys have figured it out, all your problems? That's kind of part one.
I would like to think that we'll have solved a bunch of these things in this calendar year. I think we'll be able to make a pretty big difference on our own operations. Obviously not anyone else's, but I think we'll have we'll make a pretty good dent in it. And I would say the difference is not between what we will be able to do and the ideal is not mostly technical, but mostly organizational.
So my follow-up question is, what can CMG do to help Capital One and other companies that are basically moving in this direction?
How can you help? Well, I would like to think that a presentation like this at least will help, make people aware that it's the same except it's completely different, and to identify some of those things. Perhaps working, as an industry, we work with some of the providers of data to maybe put them in better alignment as to how data will be used and consumed for this purpose, because it's quite a problem for things to be semantically mismatched. I guess that would be the two ways that I think are the most impact. Yeah.
Wait for the microphone, please. You wouldn't have the sound on the camera.
Yeah, I was thinking to myself, maybe sharing more experiences on how people are doing their own planning and what are the issues that we're dealing with, so everybody gets to find out what everybody else is doing. So not everybody is reinventing the same wheel as we keep on doing. So that would be a good way for CMG to help with.
Oh, you mean to share best practices
or just experiences in general? Yeah, I don't know the best practices, but their practices.
Well, I'm a big favor of a big fan of sharing worst practices too, right? I mean, well, you're laughing, but I mean, don't fall in that hole over here. That's a pretty big, pretty important piece of thing, to disseminate, right? I mean, it can be a little embarrassing, but what can I say? All right, one more question. In the back.
Hi, I'm Rashmi. I work for Southwest Airlines. One of our applications, which we regularly performance test, is moving to cloud, but the perception among the development team is that we don't need to performance test it once it moves to cloud. So, so I'm going to establish a baseline. We have recently started, so I'm going to establish a baseline test for them, but how do I change that perception?
So
Thank you.
how would you change your, I mean, how do you, that's a great question. The first thing I would say is like, why don't you think you need to do this in a cloud? I mean, all right, so we'll go back to my favorite, hobby horse, right? There is no such thing as a cloud. It's just someone else's data center, right? If you sold your data center to somebody else, me, right, and the title changed, but otherwise you used it the same way, would that change the way you need to do a performance test in someone else's data center? I mean, it's the same computers, right? Probably not, right? Because your programs don't really care who owns the title on the computers. You don't have to, I don't want to be dismissive about this because without putting a too fine a point on it, some of this comes from like hard-earned experience, right? But really, a computer is a computer. And frankly, the chips are still the same chips. I mean, you can still buy a Skylake just like Amazon, can buy a Skylake, right? And those network pipes are still the same network pipes, except maybe they're shared more, right? I don't know why you would think that you don't have to do a performance, test in a cloud because you can get more. You could still get more in a data center. It was harder to do it because you'd have to ask more people, right? I guess the other thing to say is that, and I believe me, Eeyore can attest, I've said this to many people, right, in not so disguised terms. It's like, so you don't care about the performance any, right, because you can just turn some more on, right? Who's going to pay for that? Actually, if I go back, see this one here next to the last bullet? We have some teams that are spending 3 times as much as they need to. 3 times, right? That's tens of thousands of dollars a month. That's missing. And by the way, that's 3 times as much, even if I assume that their code is perfect. And I probably don't need to explain my assumption there, right? 3 times as much money as your budget goes is like, the word hemorrhage on there is on there for a reason. So I mean, I really can't think of anything more incorrect than I'm in a cloud. I don't need to do the test anymore.
What I hear when I hear that is I don't care about cost.
Well, and you know what? If you're spending $50 a month and you're making $1 million a month, well, great. You probably don't care about the cost. Well, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I agree.
It's a way to disarm that argument.
Nobody's tracking that. Connie Smith and I laughed about the cloud years ago. We said the same thing, that for the first time you finally put a credit card on crappy performance. But the downside is nobody's really tracking that data and reporting it.
Well, I don't know about nobody, right? I mean, certainly we do. And we send people bills, right? And people know what their profit and loss looks like. Now it's at a relatively senior level of the organization, right? So it's like we don't push the profit and loss down to the individual DevOps engineer, because if we did that,
that's where I'm going with this. I'm not talking about you're not reporting numbers. I'm saying the connection between the numbers that the bills that they're getting and the crappy performance, to Andre's question, that linkage is missing.
I know what the link is.
well, I'm over time, am I not?
Yes, we are at the end of time, but the good news is we are moving into a break.
Okay.
Brian, thank you.
Thank you.